Cowan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I add my congratulations to the honourable members for Slough, Stoke-on-Trent South, Kingston-upon-Hull West and Hessel, which apparently is one constituency, and Wolverhampton South West on their maiden speeches here today. I'm sure you're already aware that next time you speak you won't be listened to with such reverential tones, I'm afraid. I'll do my best. On drug policy reform, there are two problems that we're trying to address. One is a crime surrounding illegal drugs, and the other is a harm that is done by addiction to drugs. The first, technically, looks quite easy. We could look to decriminalise and legislate for drugs. Overnight, you take away all the power from the criminals. The second is harder, but would be easier when the victims are not being stigmatised and driven into the arms of criminals. The government report launched last Friday failed to address those core issues. Despite a few nods in the direction of health care, the UK government has fundamentally missed the point again. The Home Secretary says she wants a strategy to deliver a drug-free society, and that in a nutshell is why the strategy is seriously flawed, because the drugs are not the problem. When we should be asking, why do people take drugs, and why do some 10% of users develop an addiction? What leads people to abuse drugs? That's the issue. And if the Minister thinks by coming down hard on criminals we will remove the drugs from society and therefore end the need, we are delusional. Because we've been trying that for years and the situation has only got worse. Latest figures show the highest numbers of fatalities since comparable records began 24 years ago, 50 each week across the UK, with deaths from heroin doubling in 3 years. Yet this government brushed aside testimonies from Anyone's Child campaign. Anyone's Child represent people who have lost relatives and now bravely argue for legalisation and regulation to prevent others sharing their agonies. While I welcome the talk about renewed focus on the importance of evidence-based drug treatment services and moves to address underlying factors such as inadequate housing, unemployment and mental health problems, the government's big message is still about tough law enforcement. When is the government going to comprehend that drug reform is a health issue and the war on drugs, as it has been waged for the last 100 years, has failed? We will never bring it to an end, for our primary focus is stamping down on dealers and users, and continue to do that, we marginalise the very people we should be seeking to help. This is a cowardly report and an opportunity lost. There are events in history that we could be learning from, but we seem to be ignoring. We've already mentioned in the USA they banned alcohol, but people wanted alcohol. So instead of government licensed manufacturers and a state-enforced quality control system with a recognised distribution network and licensed premises to sell alcohol, all of which paid tax to the government, we had prohibition. Prohibition encouraged criminals who produced substances of dubious integrity which they sold at whatever prices they liked in establishments that were unfit for purpose, all of which was fiercely protected by unrestrained violence. The crime rate soared, people died from consuming the product, addiction increased, and rivals died in violent turf wars. Corruption was rampant, and communities lived in fear. Does this sound familiar? Today's drug war mirrors the same process, only it's now on a far larger scale because we've encouraged it to grow over a longer period of time. Stamping down hard on the criminals that control the growth, harvesting and distribution of drugs has only increased the levels of violence, fear and corruption which is used to hold on to and grow their marketplace. Once we started the war that we were never going to win, ending it becomes increasingly difficult. The onus is on us to justify the time, the cost in human lives, misery and taxpayers' money, and why we started it in the first place. If we can't do that, then the only option seems to be to plough on, doggedly proclaiming that we were right all along and steadfastly refusing to listen to alternative strategies aimed at resolving the same issue. And that is where we are now in the war on drugs. Rather like the generals of the First World War ordering tens of thousands of conscripts over the top in a futile show of strength, we cannot see a way to get out that justifies the loss or the sacrifice made, so we continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. We should note that when Prohibition ended in 1933, the crime rate and addiction rate plummeted. Transform published a report in response to the latest offering from the UK Government, in which they point out that according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, taking a criminal justice-led approach to drugs creates a vast criminal market, siphons resources away from health, shifts drugs dealing and trafficking around, switches users between drugs, and stigmatises and drives people who use drugs from seeking help. In other words, prohibition is a discredited and deadly way to make drugs stronger and more dangerous while funding organised crime. The National Treatment Agency estimates that the combined cost of substance abuse to society is £15.4 billion a year. The cost of human life and the suffering of addicts, friends and families can never be quantified. As the war continues, there are more addicts, more cost, more pain and no signs that things will improve. The current approach isn't working. We need a fundamental change of philosophy. There's a growing body of well-informed people that say it's time to decriminalise and legalise drugs. They aren't lily-livered do-gooders. They aren't hippies left over from the 60s. They are ex and current law enforcement officers. People who've seen the problems up close and personal. People who've spent decades locking people up and come to the conclusion their actions didn't make a blind bit of difference. That's a tough call, to recognise you had it wrong. So these people from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, or LEAP, should be listened to. A week ago I hosted a dinner in the House of Commons, 24 of us round a table. Representatives from the Royal Society for Public Health, the British Medical Association, the British Medical Journal, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, the Royal College of Nursing, Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Emergency Medicine, the Faculty of Public Health, University of Cambridge, Transform, Buchanan Institute, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the House of Lords. While we were there, most of us self-administered psychoactive substances. All representatives spoke openly and honestly, and the general consensus was the current drugs policy isn't working, and the war on drugs should be a health-led issue, not a criminal justice one. So why is self-administrating a drug illegal? Technically, the answer is we made that particular drug illegal. We put it on a list. As I mentioned earlier at my meeting, most of us self-administered psychoactive substances, but alcohol is not on the list. So we've created a problem, and now we can't fix it, unless, of course, we decriminalised and controlled the production, quality and distribution of the drugs. Then we could tax them and use the money to provide better treatment, rehabilitation and harm reduction services, rather like we do with alcohol, but hopefully a lot more effectively. We haven't always had our current attitude to drugs, and we haven't always just a violence and crime surrounding drugs. A good few years ago, there was a regular festival of music and arts. It was an annual event. Drug taking was a big part of the festival. It was acknowledged and accepted. The festival was frequented by lots of people, including a few celebrities. You probably know a few of their names: Sophocles, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, those kind of dudes. Only 100 years ago, UK pharmacies would sell many products made from derivatives of heroin or cocaine. Cough mixtures contained opiates, and department stores sold heroin tins. In 1971, when the Misuse of Drugs Act was signed, we had 1,300 people who had a problem with drugs. 46 years of a war on drugs, and we now have 380,000. And yet this is a policy the government still wish to pursue. So if we decriminalise or legalise drugs, the one issue we'd be left with is one we should be addressing right now. Why do some people become addicts? Because if we can solve that issue, then we'll be going a long way to winning the war on drugs. So what do we know? Professor Bruce Alexander used to perform experiments on rats. he was familiar with the Skinner box. A Skinner box just seems a good place to study drug addiction. Scientists had perfected techniques that allowed rats to inject small doses of drug into themselves by pressing a lever. This required tethering the rat to the ceiling of the box and implanting a needle into their jugular veins. The drug passed through the tube and the needle into the rat's bloodstreams, and almost instantaneously when they pushed the lever. Under appropriate conditions, rats would press the lever often enough to consume large amounts of heroin, morphine, amphetamine, cocaine and other drugs. Then, along with his colleagues Robert Combs, Patricia Hadaway and Barry Bernstein, he created Rat Park. It was a heaven for rats, areas to move freely, dig, socialise and breed. He gave those rats 2 water bottles. One was laced with morphine. None of the rats developed an addiction. Clearly the environment the rats lived in was a factor, not the only factor, but a major one. And so the obvious question is, have we ever tried this experiment on humans? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. And we gave it a name: the Vietnam War. Ship hundreds of thousands of young men thousands of miles from home and drop them into a hellhole. Very quickly the US military realised that a large percentage was smoking pot, so they clamped down. The men turned to heroin. It was harder for the authorities to find and confiscate. At the end of the Vietnam War, the authorities expected a large number of heroin addicts were about to be repatriated to their hometowns and cities. They expected a massive problem, but it didn't happen. Once back home, amongst their family and friends, the vast majority had kicked the habit within a year. Those that didn't were amongst those living in the poorest conditions or had other issues that had led to their addiction in the first place. We see the same behaviour of increased addiction when Indigenous people were forced off their land and into reservations and camps by white settlers in the USA, Canada and Australia. So what can we do? Recently, some countries, as we've talked about earlier, have pursued alternative policies that involve the decriminalisation of drug possession. Argentina, Estonia, Australia and Portugal have all taken a health-centred approach to the issue. In Portugal, they've decriminalised drug use. When the penalties for personal possession were removed, drug addiction declined. Rather than criminalising the people, they were passed on to a dissuasion committee. Not a term I'm fond of, it sounds a bit Orwellian, but it consists of members of health, social work and law professions. Those considered to be addicts or problematic users are forwarded to treatment and rehabilitation programmes. According to the Royal Society for Public Health, within 10 years of the implementation of these policies, the number of drug addicts in Portugal has halved. If the UK achieved the same success, the Buchanan Institute estimates the financial saving would be around £7.7 billion a year. For the record, I don't take illegal drugs. That's my choice. But if I chose to, within the privacy of my own home, I honestly don't see what harm that would do to society at large. How would arresting me improve anything? And yet we prosecute people regularly. And it has to be said, primarily poor people. We seem to have one approach to law enforcement. If you're a rich city slicker sniffing a line of cocaine in your penthouse suite, and quite another if you're a kid in a council estate smoking a joint. And it's no coincidence that the areas of the UK with the highest level of social deprivation are the areas with the highest numbers of drug-related deaths. Today, according to Prison Reform Trust, 1 in 10 people in custody are there because of a drug-related offence. And as we've seen in recent years, some of our prisons have serious problems with synthetic drugs or spice. Those with the least access to money and lawyers, those who are the less socially mobile, will always be more vulnerable. Our attitude to drug consumption has to change, and only then can we see the issue as addiction, and addiction is a health issue, not a criminal one. We must look to decriminalise and legislate. In doing so, we take the power away from criminals and we put the money into education, rehabilitation and reducing drug harm. Yeah.